A random drunken phrase from a friend broke up my engagement. Not because of cheating, not because of lying, but because of my college experience. I met Jack 3 years ago, on a rainy Friday night at a house party hosted by a mutual friend, the kind of gathering where half the faces were strangers and the other half were too loud to hold a proper conversation. At first, we barely spoke. I remember noticing him across the room, standing near the kitchen counter with a drink in his hand, laughing at something someone said, but I was caught up in another conversation and didn't think much of it. There was nothing cinematic about that first meeting, just a quick hello and a shared glance that barely lingered before the night pulled us in opposite directions. But a week later, I ran into him again. This time at a bar downtown, one of those dimly lit places with a half-broken jukebox and sticky floors, where the drinks were strong and the noise didn't try to drown out your thoughts. He was standing near the bar, and this time he recognized me first, walking over with a casual smile and saying something about déjà vu. We ended up talking for hours, tucked into a booth with chipped wood and low light, swapping stories about childhood, bad dates, and the weird little things that made us laugh. There was no pretense, no pressure, just this strange, immediate sense of comfort that I didn't expect to feel with someone I barely knew. And that's where it all really started. We were similar in so many ways that it felt almost effortless to fall into step with each other, like meeting someone whose rhythm matched mine without needing to adjust a single beat. From the very beginning, there was a connection, something quiet but unmistakable, that made every conversation feel like it had already begun long before we ever met. We shared a sense of humor that clicked instantly, the kind where one half-joke could spiral into an entire evening of laughter, and our interests overlapped in ways that made everything feel just a little more natural, whether it was books, music, or the way we both preferred rainy days over clear ones. But more than that, it was the support that caught me off guard. Jack listened when I spoke, not just nodding along but really hearing me, asking questions that showed he wanted to understand more than just the surface. He remembered the little things, checked in after long days, and made it clear without ever needing to say it outright that I wasn't alone in whatever I was carrying. It didn't take long before I felt the shift inside me, that quiet recognition that this could be something serious. Not just fun, not just fleeting, but real. And once I felt it, it stayed with me, steady and certain, like something I had been hoping for without fully realizing it. A year after we met, we decided to move in together, and it felt less like a milestone and more like the most natural step forward, like two lives that had already begun to blend finally finding their shared space. We found a small apartment on the edge of the city, nothing fancy, but it had warm light in the mornings and just enough room for the both of us to grow into it. We filled it with mismatched furniture, secondhand bookshelves, and framed memories that slowly lined the walls, and it didn't take long before it truly felt like home. 2 years later, he proposed to me on a quiet Sunday afternoon. There was no grand gesture or crowd watching, just the two of us in our favorite park, beneath a tree we had sat under a dozen times before, where the world always seemed to slow down. He reached into his jacket pocket with slightly shaking hands, looked me in the eyes with this kind of quiet certainty, and asked me to marry him. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation, without fear, without second-guessing, because in that moment, there was nothing to weigh, nothing to question. I was sure. It was the happiest period of my life. Days filled with soft plans for the future, laughter over dinner, and a calm kind of joy that made me believe we had built something truly lasting. We never talked about our past in detail, not because we were hiding anything, but because it simply didn't feel necessary at the time. We both knew that we had lived full lives before meeting each other, that there had been other relationships, other heartbreaks, other versions of ourselves shaped by people who came and went. But we never sat down and shared the specifics, never traded names or timelines or the kinds of memories that might stir up questions we weren't ready to ask. What we had now felt like enough, strong, whole, and present. We were focused on building something forward, not digging through what had come before. It felt like a silent agreement, a mutual understanding that the past was the past, and that the version of each other we had found here and now was the one that mattered most. In our intimate life, everything felt good in a way that was steady, safe, and deeply reassuring. Jack was always caring, always attentive, never rushing me or making me feel like I had to be anything other than exactly who I was in that moment. There was a gentleness to the way he touched me, the way he asked questions with his eyes and waited for answers in the way I moved or breathed. Sometimes he would suggest something new, a quiet curiosity wrapped in trust, and more often than not, I would say yes, not out of obligation but because I felt safe exploring with him. When something didn't feel right to me, I could say no without fear, and he never made me feel guilty for it. There was no pressure, no resentment, no unspoken debts hanging in the air. Just us, learning each other slowly, with respect and care at the center of everything. One night we invited some friends over, just a small gathering at our apartment, the kind that didn't require much planning beyond some finger food, a few bottles of wine, and enough chairs to squeeze everyone into the living room. Most of the people who came were my college friends, people I hadn't seen in far too long, the kind of friends you hug a little tighter when they walk through the door because there's so much history wrapped up in their presence. The energy in the room was warm and easy, filled with old jokes, loud laughter, and that nostalgic kind of storytelling that always begins with, "Do you remember when?" Everyone was happy to see each other after such a long time, and it felt like the kind of night you remember for all the right reasons. Comfortable, effortless, and full of the kind of joy that doesn't ask for attention. Jack moved through the group with his usual calm charm, handing out drinks, laughing at stories he hadn't been a part of, and blending in like he'd always belonged. I watched him from across the room at one point, smiling at how naturally he fit into my world, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. At the party we were playing a game of trivia, one of those spontaneous ideas that starts with someone digging through a closet for an old board game and ends up with everyone shouting answers and laughing too loud over ridiculous questions. At first, it was lighthearted and fun, the kind of thing that reminded us why we'd all stayed friends for so long, but as the drinks kept flowing and the energy got a little looser, the tone of the game started to shift. People began veering off into personal stories, memories from college that resurfaced in broken bursts, half-laughed confessions mixed with inside jokes. Then, out of nowhere, one of my friends, someone who had definitely had more than a few drinks and whose filter had long since disappeared, blurted out a comment that froze the room. It was something about my college years, something messy and unpolished, a version of me that Jack had never heard about, never seen, never even guessed at. It wasn't cruel, not meant to hurt, but it was real and raw, said with the casual confidence of someone who assumes everyone already knows the story. I felt the air shift immediately. The laughter stopped for just a beat too long. And when I looked at Jack, I saw it. The flicker of confusion, surprise, and something else behind his eyes, something I couldn't yet name, but it chilled me all the same. I felt the air change the second those words left my friend's mouth, the warmth of the evening suddenly thinning into something colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves had pulled in closer. Jack didn't say a word, didn't flinch or raise his voice, but when I turned to look at him, I saw everything I feared written across his face in a silence that screamed. His eyes met mine, and for a moment it felt like he was searching for an explanation I hadn't prepared, one I never imagined I would need to give. There was shock there, clear and sharp, like he'd just glimpsed a version of me he hadn't known existed and wasn't sure how to reconcile with the woman sitting beside him. Beneath it, there was sadness, not loud or dramatic but quiet and slow, the kind of sadness that seeps in when something sacred feels suddenly distant. And then, worst of all, there was distrust. Not overt, not angry, but heavy in the way he held my gaze just a little too long, like he was trying to figure out what else he didn't know, what else I hadn't said. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a story from the past. It was about the crack that had just opened between us, the one I wasn't sure I could close. When the guests finally left and the door clicked shut behind the last round of hugs and goodbyes, we began cleaning up without saying a word, the silence between us louder than any music that had played that night. We moved around each other like strangers, collecting empty glasses, wiping crumbs from the table, stacking plates in the sink with the kind of mechanical rhythm that fills the space when words feel too dangerous. I could feel the weight of his thoughts in the way he moved, in the way he avoided looking directly at me, and I knew that the conversation was coming. It wasn't a matter of if, only when. And when it did come, it was quiet, almost too quiet. He set down a glass and asked, without anger but with something unsteady in his voice, "Have you done this before?" I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. The memory my friend had carelessly dragged into the room, that past version of me I had tried to leave buried, was now standing between us like a shadow. I looked at him and answered honestly, simply because there was no point in hiding now. I said yes. Yes, I had, but it was many years ago in a life I had long since left behind. The truth sat there between us, raw and unadorned, and all I could do was wait to see what he would do with it. He was upset, not so much by the fact itself, but by the fact that I hadn't told him, that I had kept that part of my life sealed away while we were building something he believed was grounded in honesty. It wasn't the past that hurt him, it was the silence around it, the realization that there had been a version of me he had never been allowed to meet, even as he had given me all of himself without hesitation. What stung even more, I could tell, was the subtle double standard he felt growing between us, the way I had always hesitated or said no when he asked to explore certain things in our intimacy, things that now, suddenly, he knew I had once said yes to with someone else. It wasn't about jealousy in the traditional sense, but more about a kind of emotional whiplash, like he had trusted the boundaries I set without question and was now left wondering if those lines were about comfort or about him. He wasn't angry in a loud or cruel way, but the pain in his voice when he finally said, "You gave someone else more than you gave me, and then you shut that door without even letting me know it existed," pierced through me in a way I didn't know how to respond to. Because he was right, not in accusation but in feeling. And for the first time, I saw how the weight of my silence had become its own kind of betrayal. I tried to explain, gently and as honestly as I could, that it wasn't about him, that it was never a reflection of what he lacked or anything he had done wrong. It was about my experience, about the version of myself that existed back then, reckless, uncertain, searching for validation in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I told him that the choices I made weren't grounded in freedom or joy, but in confusion and a lack of self-worth, that back then I said yes to things not because they felt right, but because I didn't know how to say no, or didn't believe I was allowed to. I tried to help him see that the distance between who I was then and who I am now is vast, shaped by years of growth, reflection, and quiet healing. I told him that the things I once agreed to now feel different, that they no longer feel like curiosity or adventure, but like echoes of a version of me I've worked hard to move past. I said that what feels right now is choosing comfort, safety, and boundaries that are mine, not because I'm withholding but because I've learned to protect the parts of myself that I once gave away too easily. I could see he was listening, really listening, even if the words didn't land exactly how I hoped. And even though it hurt to see the conflict still flickering in his eyes, I knew I had told him the truth. And sometimes truth is the only offering we have. But he took it as a personal insult, as if my past choices were a direct comparison that he had somehow lost. His face tightened with a mix of hurt and resentment, and then he said it, "So I'm less important to you than those guys from college?" His voice sharp, not loud, but brittle with the kind of pain that had clearly been building underneath his silence. I tried to dispel that myth immediately, tried to explain again that it had nothing to do with importance or comparison, that the way I navigate intimacy now comes from a completely different place, shaped by time, by trauma, by healing, not by the people who came before him. I told him that back then I didn't value myself enough to draw boundaries, that what I gave wasn't a gift, it was a transaction I didn't fully understand I was making. And what I choose to give now, in this relationship, is shaped by care and consciousness, not fear or guilt. But he wouldn't listen. His mind was already closing in on that one idea, and everything I said seemed only to reinforce what he had already decided was true. I saw the wall go up behind his eyes, and in that moment, I realized that what we were fighting wasn't just about my past. It was about his sense of worth, and about the ways love can twist into a mirror of every insecurity we've never dared to name. We became estranged in a way that didn't happen all at once but crept in slowly, filling the spaces between us with silence so thick it felt like another presence in the room. For several days, we lived like strangers, sharing the same apartment, passing each other in the hallway, brushing shoulders in the kitchen. But without warmth, without laughter, without even the simplest touch that used to come so naturally. The intimacy we had once built so carefully now felt like it had been wrapped in ice, and every word we didn't say only added another layer. I tried to give him space, stepping back when he seemed withdrawn, avoiding pushing conversations he clearly wasn't ready for, hoping that time might soften whatever was brewing inside him. But I was hurt too. I was hurting not just because of the tension but because I had told him the truth, my truth, and it had been met not with understanding but with judgment and distance. I kept wondering if I had said too much or not enough, if I had explained it the wrong way, if there was something I could do to fix what now felt irreparably cracked. But every time I reached for him, even in small ways, he pulled back just enough to remind me that I wasn't welcome in his grief. And in that space between us, we both started to quietly unravel. I offered to talk because the silence was beginning to feel unbearable, like we were both slowly suffocating under the weight of everything left unsaid. We sat on the couch for a long time, not touching, a cushion of space between us that felt heavier than it looked, filled with all the things we were afraid to confront. I spoke first, carefully, slowly, trying to keep my voice steady even though my chest felt tight with the ache of holding it all in. I explained again that my boundaries, especially in our intimacy, were not a rejection of him, not a punishment or a judgment, but a way of honoring what I had learned through pain and survival. I told him that setting those limits was how I protected the parts of myself that had been bruised by years of saying yes when I didn't mean it, by confusing compliance with connection. I repeated over and over that this wasn't about him being less or not enough, that it wasn't about comparison to anyone who came before, but about choosing differently now, from a place of self-respect rather than guilt or fear. I wanted him to see that loving him didn't mean losing myself, that the woman he had fallen in love with was shaped by her history, not ashamed of it. But as I spoke, I could see how hard it was for him to hear me through the noise of his own hurt, and even though he listened, even though he nodded, something in his eyes stayed distant, as if the version of me he wanted was slipping further out of reach. But he admitted, quietly and with a heaviness in his voice I'd never heard before, that something had changed. He said he could no longer look at me the way he used to, that something inside him had shifted the night of that party, and no matter how much he wanted to move past it, he couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. There was no anger in his voice, no accusations or raised tones, just a tired kind of sadness, the kind that comes when love has been wounded in a place too deep to fully heal. We both sat there in silence after that, letting the truth settle between us, knowing it was something we couldn't talk our way out of. We realized, slowly and without needing to say much more, that the trust we had once held so tightly had been shaken at its foundation, and no matter how much care or effort we poured into it now, the cracks were already there. Our love, which had once felt strong and solid, simply could not stand under the weight of what had been revealed, and the way it had made him question not just me but himself. We broke up that night, not with bitterness, not with shouting, but with the kind of pain that comes from knowing you still love someone and yet cannot build a future together. It hurt deeply, in the quiet, irreversible way that only real endings do. But beneath the pain there was also a fragile sense of clarity, a realization that sometimes the past doesn't let the future flourish, no matter how badly we want it to. And so we let each other go, not because we stopped caring, but because holding on any longer would have meant losing ourselves.